Tender, smoky, delicious barbecued chicken, smoked mozzarella, homemade barbecue sauce, piled up on scratch-made pizza crust that's soft and chewy on the inside and a little bit crispy on the bottom. That's right, we're talking about barbecue chicken pizza. In today's episode of what I guess I'll call my unofficial summer smoking series, we're making an absolutely from scratch barbecue chicken pizza that includes smoking an entire chicken, whipping up some of my homemade barbecue sauce, and even smoking some mozzarella cheese to just elevate it to another level for my barbecue pizza. We're going to go through every step from beginning to end in assembling all of these different ingredients, all into an amazing pizza, and we're even going to be cooking that in the smoker. There's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it and take a look at the chicken we're going to be smoking today. Here I've got a whole 5-pound chicken, and today I'm going to be spatchcocking the chicken so it will lay flat in the smoker and cook much more quickly. Spatchcocking a chicken is a pretty simple operation. Mostly it just involves removing the spine. I'll start by making a shallow cut on either side of the backbone just to help me pay attention to where I need to snip. Using some decent kitchen shears, I'll just start snipping through the chicken along those cuts until I've gone all the way through and I can remove the spine. Lastly, I'll lightly slice into the bit of cartilage between the back side of the breasts, and now I can open this bird up quite wide and it will lay nice and flat. Now, this part of the video is actually from yesterday because I am brining this bird before smoking, and it basically needs to brine overnight. So I'm going to put the chicken into a medium-sized stock pot and then start adding my brine ingredients. Starting with 3/4 cup of kosher salt, followed by a 1/2 cup of white sugar, a bunch of whole smashed garlic cloves, about a tablespoon of whole peppercorns, and my secret ingredient, 1 cup of dill pickle juice. Now I'll top everything up with a gallon of cold water, give it all a good stir, and now I'm just putting this whole thing into the refrigerator until tomorrow. Brining a chicken that is going to go on a smoker for several hours is going to help it stay moist and tender and also make it more flavorful than a dry rub alone. Now it's the next day, and I've thoroughly rinsed my chicken in the sink to make sure any of that excess brine is washed off. Now I'm patting it relatively dry with some paper towel, and now is when some dry rub is coming into the picture. I won't go too crazy with it, and I'm not trying to create a thick bark, but a nice dusting of this chicken rub is going to help add a little extra flavor. It's finally time to fire up the smoker. In my case, the Oklahoma Joe Offset Smoker Grill Combo. I'll get a chimney full of lump charcoal burning, and then into the firebox it goes, along with a couple hunks of hardwood. As I often do, I'm using a combination of oak and maple. I'll let the smoker come up to temperature, and then it's finally time to get this bird cooking. I'm going to maintain a temperature of between 275 and 300 degrees Fahrenheit until the internal temperature of this chicken is probing at least 165 in the breasts and at least 185 in the thighs. I'll use my real-time barbecue thermometer to monitor one of the breasts and let this thing smoke away. It will take somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 hours to smoke a spatchcocked chicken of this size. Alright, the chicken's on the smoker, and we've got a few hours to put together the rest of the pieces for this pizza. But we're actually going to start by going back in time about 5 days when I made my smoked mozzarella. Well, I didn't make the mozzarella, but I definitely smoked it. I'm using an ordinary log of fresh mozzarella cheese from the grocery store, but before I start smoking it, I want to pat it dry and leave it uncovered in the fridge overnight. The outside of fresh mozzarella gets pretty wet and slimy, and I want to dry it out a little bit before I put it in the smoker. Okay, it's the next morning, and it's time to smoke. As I would with any cheese, I'm going to be cold smoking this mozzarella. I want the smoke, but I don't want the heat because, well, the cheese would melt and become unusable. So I have one of these cold smoking pellet tubes. I'll fill it up with some smoker pellets. In my case, I'm using applewood pellets. These smoker tubes are very simple to use. Using my torch, I'll light some of the pellets near the open end and let them burn away for about 10 minutes. At that time, I'll blow out the open flame and these pellets will just smolder away, creating lots of applewood smoke with practically no heat. Now I've got the cheese on a wire rack and it's going in. I'm going to let it smoke for 2 hours, and I'll flip and rotate the cheese halfway through. A smoke tube this size will smolder for something like 3 to 5 hours, so I'll have plenty of time to spare. Alright, our 2 hours is up and the cheese is looking very nice. But before I do anything else, I'm going to wrap it up in some plastic and let it sit in the fridge for 3 to 5 days to let the smoke flavor mellow a bit. Some people recommend letting it rest for 2 to 4 weeks, but about 5 days is all I have the patience for. After about 5 days, I'm unwrapping the cheese and slicing it up. It's definitely got a nice and smooth, smoky flavor to it. It's not overpowering, but it definitely gives it some character. Now, being that the smoked mozzarella is ready to use at this point, the first thing I really need to do today is get my pizza dough going. And that's because it needs to rise and then rest for a total of a couple hours. So I want to make sure that dough is ready to go when the chicken and all the other ingredients are ready for it. So let's go. For my dough today, I'm going to be using 00 pizza flour. I've never actually used this kind of flour before, but it's considered the gold standard for pizza, and I'm excited to see how it improves my pizza crust game. Using my stand mixer with the dough hook, I'll start by adding 325 grams of water that's been heated to between 105 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. To that, I'll sprinkle in 5 grams of yeast, I'll give it a quick stir, and then leave it alone for about 10 minutes until the yeast blooms. When it's looking nice and foamy, in goes 500 grams of my 00 flour, and then 10 grams of kosher salt. I'll set my mixer to the number 2 setting and let it mix away for a couple minutes. After that, I'll increase the speed to the number 4 setting, and I'll let it mix for another full 8 minutes. When the mixing/kneading is done, I'll lightly grease a bowl with some olive oil before turning the dough out onto a floured surface. I'm going to give this dough just a couple of squeezes and squishes and then form it into a nice ball. Then drop it into that greased bowl, cover the bowl with plastic wrap, and leave it alone to rise for 1.5 hours. After 90 minutes, my dough has at least doubled in size, and now it's time to punch it down and divide it. So back onto a floured surface it goes, and I'm going to divide it into 2 pieces. This batch is big enough to make 2 medium-sized pizzas. Now to form each of those portions into tight balls, and then set them on a lightly greased cookie sheet. I'll cover that cookie sheet with more plastic wrap, taking care to press around each dough ball so they're nice and sealed. Now this whole cookie sheet is going into the fridge until I'm ready for it. It should get at least 30 minutes to rest in the fridge, but it'll be closer to an hour before I'm ready to use it, and that's just fine. Next, we're going to make the barbecue sauce, and I have a few different homemade barbecue sauces that I love. Last week, we did a cherry chipotle barbecue sauce for the venison sandwich. This week, we're going with what I would consider my sort of staple go-to standard barbecue sauce. It tastes kind of similar to Sweet Baby Ray's, minus that overly processed high fructose corn syrupy taste. Sweet, just a tiny bit spicy, all around delicious, and it works great on a barbecue pizza. For my sauce, there are a lot of ingredients, but it's very simple to make. Into a saucepan, I'll just start combining my ingredients. I'm starting with some tomato paste. No, not ketchup, because I'm an adult with self-respect and dignity. Then some water, white vinegar, brown sugar, molasses, pineapple juice, which I guess you could call my, quote, secret ingredient, followed by a little liquid smoke, and soy sauce, and the dry ingredients, onion powder, garlic powder, ancho chili powder, smoked paprika, ground mustard, kosher salt, and a little cayenne pepper. I'll get all of that whisked together very well. And by the way, I'll put the full recipe for this sauce in the video description, so don't worry about keeping track of all those ingredients I just blazed through. Now I'm moving over to the stove, and I'm going to bring this sauce up to a very low simmer on pretty low heat, stirring regularly as to not let all those sugars scorch. I'll let this simmer and reduce until it's about the consistency I want, which is, well, about the thickness of barbecue sauce. When it's looking good, I'll transfer it into a jar and put it aside until I'm ready for it later. Next, I'll do just a little more prep work. Using my Finger Mutilator 5000 vegetable mandolin, I'll thinly slice some red onion. I really do hate this thing, and I have absolutely injured myself using it, but I want some incredibly thin onion slices, and this mandolin will accomplish that. Lastly, I'll finely chop some green onion. And now the chicken has finished cooking and it's time to come off the smoker. My thermometer is reading right at 165 for the breasts and about 187 for the thighs. I'll let this entire thing rest for a solid 25 minutes before doing anything else with it. Okay, the chicken is well rested and looking very relaxed, so now I'm going to start hacking it to pieces with a big knife. And while the skin is very tasty and crispy, this chicken's destiny is to be used for pizzas. So I'm going to be removing all of the skin, basically just separating the pieces, pull off the meat, and chop it into little bite-sized pieces. For the pizza I'm making right now, I'm going to use all the dark meat from the thighs and legs. Since I'm going to be cooking my pizza in the smoker, I need to crank up the temperature. I'll load it up with some more wood and bring the temp to somewhere between 475 and 500 degrees. And I'll also put my carbon steel griddle insert into the smoking chamber and let it get good and heated up. And after 1.5 million steps, it's finally time to actually start making this pizza. First, I need to grab one of those dough balls and stretch it out into the shape of my pizza. And I am notoriously bad at stretching, rolling, or otherwise manipulating dough, so I'll just do the best I can. I will say that this is the most supple and stretchy pizza dough I've ever worked with, and I'm thinking it has to do with that fancy 00 flour I used. Once I get my dough stretched and somewhat resembling a round pizza, I'm going to sprinkle some cornmeal on my pizza peel and transfer the dough onto it. I wish this peel was a little bigger, but oh well. It's going to be easier to put it on the peel now rather than after it's loaded up with stuff. Now it's time for the toppings. I'll first give it a very light coating of my barbecue sauce. Most of the sauce will be drizzled on later, but I want to start with just a very thin base layer. Next, the chicken. I'll distribute a heavy portion of that delicious chopped up dark meat, followed by little hunks of the smoked mozzarella. I could have shredded the cheese, but for this style of pizza and this type of mozzarella, it works better to use a bunch of these little pieces. Next, I'll add some of those thin red onion strips, and then a quick brushing of olive oil on that edge of exposed crust, just to make it a little more crispy and brown. And finally, a light sprinkling of dry oregano over the whole thing. Finally ready to bake, I'll go ahead and move this pizza into the smoker. And while all the cornmeal I sprinkled on my pizza peel should have allowed it to slide effortlessly off, it was still trying to stick a bit. So I'll help it along and get it in there while only deforming it slightly. Now to let it bake until the cheese is melted and the crust is cooked all the way through. I ended up baking this pizza for a total of about 15 minutes, and I did have to open the lid a couple times during, thereby losing a bunch of heat, to give that pizza a turn, since all the heat is coming from one direction in this smoker. And once everything is looking beautiful, I'll pull it out. And that is definitely an almost round pile of goodness that mostly resembles a pizza. Now for the finishing touches. First, a generous swirl of that homemade barbecue sauce. And lastly, a sprinkle of the chopped green onion. Now to cut it up and finally take a bite. I can't even tell you how delicious that is. I may not have a lot of talent for shaping my pizza dough to be a perfect circle, and I guess I left a bit more crust than I probably needed to, but I gotta tell you, the taste is what it's all about. This is probably the best pizza crust that I've ever made from scratch, and I really think that it is thanks to that 00 pizza flour. If you haven't used it before, give it a try. This crust is just so chewy and soft in the middle, but it's got this crisp on the bottom. I don't know if you were able to hear that when I took a bite. When this thing went into the smoker, that dough was spread pretty thin, and I kind of half expected that I would end up with a thin crust pizza, but it just expands and rises and gets so just fluffy and a little chewy and just right. And I've really never had that before with my homemade pizza crust, so I'm really happy with how this came out. As for the chicken, I couldn't be happier. It has just the right amount of seasoning and salt and smoky taste, and of course using the dark meat for this pizza was definitely a winner. Super juicy, super flavorful, a little bit fatty. The smoked mozzarella, highly recommend it. I kind of wish I put more on the pizza. I think I was more fixated on making everything look nice and symmetrical for the video rather than just absolutely smothering it in cheese, but that would have been delicious. The smokiness in that cheese isn't overpowering. In fact, this whole pizza is not overly smoky, despite the fact that the whole thing was smoked in a smoker using oak hardwood. But I could have just as easily baked it in the oven and just used the smoker for the chicken and the cheese and so forth. But I'm really happy with how it came out, and having that little griddle insert thingy for my smoker really made this pretty simple to do. Anyway, I've rambled on about this pizza long enough. I'm just really happy with how it came out and how good it tastes. And check out the video description below. I'll put a link to the recipe for this homemade barbecue sauce and also the step-by-step instructions to make your own smoked mozzarella if you want to try that out. And I'll also throw some links down there to some of the gadgets and tools and things that I used in the making of this video. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future smoking videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.